I think this is a great topic to start the day because we're starting this kind of the second half of Mises U tends to be more application oriented. The theory is critical, and I don't mean to imply that's somehow lesser, but a lot of you are kind of on the ground fighting the good fight. You're the ones that are having these conversations with some of these about some of these objections to capitalism. Somebody will come to you and say, well, I see that you wear this free market t-shirt and you got all these stickers on your laptop and you must be some kind of crazy capitalist. So what do you say to this? And then they've got some kind of like gotcha, like this is the thing that's going to bring down your whole capitalist idea. So what I'd like to do here in the short time that we have is go through some of these common objections. Of course, you could just go on for days with this stuff because it's like whack-a-mole. Can't seem to knock them all out without somebody bringing up another kind of spurious objection. But we'll cover some of these, and maybe this will help with what you're confronting on a daily basis. And some of this, by the way, is not coming from what you hear is not coming from social media. It's not coming from your friends. Roommates and so forth. It's coming from your faculty who parrot some of these objections to capitalism as though they have more merit than they do. So first of all, what is capitalism? We're not talking about crony capitalism here. That's a term that we use to refer to people who have used the government to try to get some kind of special favor, to suppress their competition, to get a transfer of wealth from taxpayers. This is not what we mean when we use the word capitalism. Free markets might actually be a preferable term. There's less ambiguity there, I think. But capitalism is the word that a lot of people use to refer to free markets, and so we'll go with that. So I'm going to cover as many of these half dozen or so that I've got, and there are many more, of course, that you could think about. And if you want to talk with me afterward about others that I haven't covered, please feel free to do that. But let's first look at the rich get richer and the poor get poorer kind of objection. So a lot of this comes out of a fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth is. Wealth is being created all the time. Every time you exchange a good or service with someone else, you are creating wealth. It is not something necessarily that is tangible, and the value that you place on something is certainly not tangible. It is a subjective value. And so if you have a bicycle and I have a violin and I have no idea how to play a violin, and you broke your leg last time you were on a bicycle and you don't want to ride it anymore, but I don't have my bicycle anymore, maybe we could trade and we could come up with a mutually beneficial exchange. You understand how that works? And in doing that, even though there are no more physical items in the world than there were before the exchange, we have created wealth. And because of the error that people think wealth as being some kind of fixed quantity, then if someone has more wealth, then logically someone else must have had less wealth. And you can see why people begin to object to the very existence of billionaires. And if someone's a billionaire, the thinking is, well, they must have taken all of this wealth from someone else. They must have cheated other people. And yet what we see is that wealth has been created to such an extent that people have, even if you are relatively poor in the United States, you have an amount of wealth that would have been inconceivable to someone a few decades ago. According to a 2024 study, 98% of U.S. adults own a cell phone. For 91% of those individuals, it is a smartphone. You are carrying around more computing power than the best computers that existed in the world just a couple of three decades ago. Matt Ridley, and he was writing this maybe 20 years ago, so this has certainly changed for the better since then. Matt Ridley said that of Americans officially classified as poor, 99% have electricity, running water, flush toilets, and a refrigerator. 95% have a television, 88% a telephone, 71% a car, 70% air conditioning. Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world at one time, had none of those. So people today have wealth that is millionaire level from a few decades ago. Now, some people have said, well, you can give people gadgets and technology, and that doesn't necessarily meet all of their most important needs. Well, let's look at life expectancy. So this is life expectancy from 1982 to 2019 in the United States, divided men and women. And the different colored lines that you see there are socioeconomic deciles. So the lowest line there would be the lowest 10% by income. And you can see that for men and women, over a couple of decades, life expectancy has increased. This is a reflection of improving well-being. And things are getting better in many ways over the long term, over the short term. If you look at the way the average person lived prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to that blossoming of technology and markets and trade, typical homes, according to this book by Phil Graham and Don Boudreau, had formidable drawbacks. They rotted from alternations of wet and dry, harbored a menagerie of mice, rats, hornets, wasps, spiders, and birds, and above all, they caught fire. Does anybody really think that the Industrial Revolution made the lives of the ordinary person worse off? And the answer is yes, people actually do believe that. But realistically, if a time machine existed and you could sort of trade places with someone in the top 0.1% from 125 years ago, would you be willing to do it? And I can tell you, I would not. I like having anesthetics during surgery and Novocaine when I go to the dentist. And I like having antibiotics so that I don't die from a small infection. That turns into a large infection. I like air conditioning. I like being able to get to Auburn in 4 hours from my home instead of taking days to make the same trip. I like being able to pick up a small box and talk to my mother who lives about 3 hours away, and do that at extremely low cost. I mean, how much would it have cost you in 1900 to send 1,000 words of text to someone on the other side of the country? You write some document and you want to send it to the other side of the country. How much would that have cost? I mean, a lot. And today it's free. No TV, no radio. And you could argue that there are pluses and minuses to our distractions, but these are things that most of us would not be willing to give up. Now, I'm not often given to quoting Brad DeLong, but he wrote a great article called Cornucopia a few years ago, where he looked at how many hours of labor it would take for an average worker to afford various goods. And he looked at a prominent catalog from 1895, and then what those same things would have cost in hours of work for someone 105 years later. And so, he's somewhat restricted in the kinds of things you can look at because there are a lot of goods in 2000 that didn't exist in 1895, but you would take 6-volume set of Horatio Alger. It would take you 21 hours in 1895 for an average worker to earn enough income to buy that set. By 2000, that would have cost you 6/10 of an hour. And of course, today it would be even less. A one-speed bicycle would have cost 260 hours of work for an average worker in 1895, 7.2 hours in 2000. One exception here on this list is a sterling silver teaspoon, which would have taken 26 hours in 1895 and 34 hours in 2000. But what is it that people really wanted out of a sterling silver spoon? They wanted it to not corrode, right? And so if you have stainless steel or plastic, or some other substance that's not going to corrode, then that might do just as well. And that is, of course, dirt cheap today, stainless steel tableware. Steinway piano here, 2,400 hours in 1895, 1,100 hours in 2000. But of course, we all have access to concert quality music at very, very low cost today. And we've got a library of music and books and other media that's available to all of us at extremely low cost. Turning to the idea of economic freedom, there's a commonly used index of economic freedom that's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. I've got the address down here. It's put out by the Fraser Institute in Canada. And it's quite useful. They update it every 2 or 3 years, I think. And they go through ratings of countries on how economically free they are on 5 or 6 different categories. And you can see that here, the income share of the lowest 10% of the population, lowest 10% by income, doesn't vary much by the level of economic freedom. The top quartile in blue here has about the same share of total income as the least free countries. And yet, if you look at the amount of income that represents, the poorest 10% are a lot better off in the most free countries. If you have more economic freedom, you're going to be better off. If you are relatively poor, if you're in that bottom 10%. Now, Mark Thornton, I believe on Friday, is going to be giving a talk on inequality, and I'm not going to dwell on inequality as a kind of a criticism of capitalism here, but I do want to point out that people are better off under regimes, under economic systems that have more economic freedom, which we might broadly refer to as more capitalist. Poverty levels. If you look at the level of absolute poverty, which is, this is from the 2023 Social Progress Index that they're getting this data from. In the most economically free countries, 1% of the population is at that very, very low level of income. In the least free countries, it's almost a third of the population that's at that level. Well, the second objection I wanted to turn to is this. When you hear this a lot, socialism works in Europe. If we could only be more like Europe. Well, I hope you don't like air conditioning, but if you have heard this before, comparisons of the United States to some European country, unfavorable comparison, like we're worse off in some dimension, maybe they're happier in Europe or something like that. Well, let's deal with that. Let's look at that same economic freedom index, and these are the top 30 nations by economic freedom. And you will notice that they include many European countries. Europe is not as socialist as many people claim relative to other countries. It actually has a great deal of economic freedom. There's a lot of freedom to trade. Now, they do have a large kind of welfare state in many European countries, but their socialism is kind of spotty. If you look at the Netherlands, for example, the Netherlands rank number 8 as far as the quality of their legal system and preservation of property rights. Property rights are fundamental to free markets. So if you're ranking very, very high on these kinds of dimensions of protection of property rights, preserving your ability to go to court and secure those rights, well, I mean, if there are other things that are less consistent with a free market, they may be able to compensate somewhat. The Netherlands is also number 14, very high on their freedom to trade internationally. So these important economic freedoms kind of offset some of the areas where these countries are not so free. In the United States, for example, in this last index, which I think their data came from 2021, so it's a little bit old now. But at the time, we were number 45 on the freedom to trade internationally. I suspect that's dropped. And we were number 18, below the Netherlands by a good bit, on our legal system and preservation of property rights. So I think it's inappropriate to say, well, socialism works in the Netherlands and therefore it can work in the United States, because the Netherlands are a reasonably nice place to live, largely because socialism in some dimensions has been mixed with a large quantity of economic freedom in other dimensions, and likewise for the United States. Now, these are the bottom 30 nations in that index, and some nations did not get ranked because they could not get enough information from those economies. So you won't see North Korea here. You won't see Cuba here. I don't think Haiti is here. These are countries where the freedom to trade, the security of property rights, those kind of basic elements of free markets are just present in very, very low levels. Many of these countries are in Africa, 20 of the bottom 30. Georgia Yitte, a scholar from Ghana, has argued that Africa is poor because she is not free. And there are some rising African scholars who are starting continuing, because Georgia Yitte did this many years ago, but are continuing to point out that Africa's problems are largely due to a lack of economic freedom. We've used some measurements that maybe are centered on measurements as far as you can measure the economy, but what about other things? I mean, maybe happiness is greater in countries that have less GDP, less income. Well, is that really true? Now, a lot of this kind of criticism dates back to over 50 years now, to a study by Richard Easterlin, and it led to something called the Easterlin paradox. And the argument was, countries that are wealthier, people are less happy in those countries, and some countries that are poorer, people are more happy, and so therefore we shouldn't be really trying to maximize economic growth and development. We should really be thinking about these less tangible things. So two studies done later in 2008 showed that this supposed paradox doesn't exist. Countries, this is according to Matt Ridley again, rich people are happier than poor people, rich countries have happier people than poor countries, and people get happier as they get richer. The earlier study, the Easterlin study, simply had samples too small to find significant differences. Now, of course, trying to measure happiness is kind of silly anyway. How do we even do this? But if you're going to try to make this argument that people are happier in countries where they are poorer, well, what information we can scrounge up doesn't really support that. This graph shows self-reported life satisfaction versus GDP per capita as of last year, and there's a upward trend line there. So you can see people who have more income seem to report more happiness. Now, again, we recognize that there are serious problems with the data here, not just with measuring happiness, but with using GDP as a measure of income. But if the opponents of capitalism are going to try to use these data, well, I mean, you can use their own data and say, look, it doesn't match up. Well, a third objection is that capitalism puts profits ahead of people. You've heard this, I'm sure. And this is rooted in a misunderstanding of what profits are. Profits are not some sort of nice to have extra on top of everything that's really essential to running a business. They're not a measure of exploitation. They have an important social function, and you've heard about this earlier this week. The information that profits and losses provide is essential to resolving social problems. Murray Rothbard said that a man earns profits only if he has, by superior foresight and judgment, uncovered a maladjustment, specifically an undervaluation of certain factors by the market. By stepping into this situation and gaining the profit, he calls everyone's attention to that maladjustment and sets forces into motion that eventually eliminate it. If we must condemn anyone, it should not be the profit-making entrepreneur, but the one that has suffered losses. For losses are a sign that he has added further to a maladjustment through allocating factors where they were overvalued. So, profits are to be celebrated, not regarded as some sort of indicator that someone has cheated or exploited or robbed another individual. Now, there's a complex mythology around this kind of idea, and this is one of those. This picture here is a Ford Pinto, and if you may not have seen one of these in the wild, but they were a very inexpensive compact car produced in the 1970s. The 1970s were not the peak of car design, but this car was designed by Ford to be very inexpensive. It became the center of a kind of auto safety push, spearheaded by a guy named Ralph Nader. And there were several tragic accidents in which people were killed, but they had been rear-ended in their Pintos, like this one evidently has been, and the vehicle would catch fire because the fuel tank was in the rear of the vehicle and was vulnerable to being punctured in a rear-end collision. So this was regarded as evidence that Ford had been negligent. In fact, a criminal case was brought that accused Ford of sacrificing people's lives in order to gain higher profits. Well, everyone makes these kinds of decisions about how much money of their own resources to put into safety for themselves. And you make these decisions all the time. I mean, I chose to drive here down I-85 to come to this conference, and I-85 is not hazard-free. And so in some sense, I was accepting a very small probability of losing my life driving to this conference. Now, if my life were infinitely valuable to me, I would never have taken even that very, very small chance with my life. The fact that I did take that chance indicates that I myself don't put an infinite value on my own life. So in the argument that you'll see from business ethicists, a lot of them anyway, about this case with the Ford Pinto is that, well, Ford was making some kind of calculation where they decided that people's lives weren't worth putting a few extra dollars into the design of this structure for the vehicle, and so therefore people lost their lives because Ford didn't value lives highly enough. Ford was producing a product that was directed at people who, in a way that would sort of match what people valued how they valued their own lives. We don't all drive around in armored personnel carriers, which presumably would be very, very safe for the occupants of the vehicle, and we don't do that because they're very expensive. I think it'd be kind of cool, but I don't own one. It would be too expensive. And that even though I could probably cash in my retirement and buy one of these things, or at least I could buy a more safe car than the one I actually drive. I drive a compact Volkswagen. I could afford something safer than what I've got, but I've chosen to spend my resources elsewhere. Ford was simply providing a product that allowed people to make that kind of choice with their resources. So there are some other kind of mythologies. Love Canal is one of the old kind of like the poster child for environmental catastrophe. And this is regarded as very bad behavior by profit-seeking chemical companies that dumped all of this nasty stuff in the ground, and then later on the whole neighborhood is evacuated because of all the nasty stuff that begins to seep out of the ground from this very badly maintained chemical dump, toxic waste dump. And so the first impression people have is that, well, this is an example of free market entrepreneurs who are pursuing profit, and this is at the expense of the environment, and the entire neighborhood suffered from their profit-seeking activity. And if you dig into the details just a little, you find that this is not actually what happened. And this is a 3,000, this particular dump was a 3,000-foot trench left over from a failed canal project, which, by the way, there were a lot of failed canal projects in certain parts of the country that were due to federal subsidies of canals. So the very fact that the trench existed was, anyway. So this is outside of Niagara Falls, New York. In the 1920s, a company began to dump their toxic waste into this location. There was clay soil, which was impermeable, so it wouldn't allow this stuff to leak out. They put a clay kind of roof on the thing, so it's enclosed in this kind of clay coffin, which would prevent that waste from leaking into the water table. And so all is well and good. It wasn't just privately owned companies, also the U.S. government and the city government that dumped toxic waste into the same location. In 1953, the city government was warned by the chemical company that then owned this land. We put toxic waste in this. But the city said, we're going to take this land and we're going to build a school on it. And the city said, if you don't do it, if you don't sell it to us, we're going to take it under the power of eminent domain. And so Hooker said, okay, but we're telling you, and we're not going to profit off of this. We're going to charge you $1, like a token payment. So we sold it to you, but we're telling you. In fact, we're going to take city officials out to the site. We're going to drill holes outside of this area and show you there's nothing toxic out here. We're going to drill into the clay coffin, and we're going to show you that's where the stuff is. And we're also going to try to get you to agree not to do anything with this land but put a park on it. In other words, don't dig here. They actually put this in the deed, said this land has chemical waste in it, tried to get the city to not use it for anything but a park. And when the school board tried to sell this land to a developer, the chemical company, even though they didn't own the land anymore, objected to this. Rick Stroop wrote that only when this waste site was taken over by local government was the site mistreated in ways that led to chemical leakage. They built a school. They removed part of the protective clay cap to use as fill dirt for another school site. That's great. And sold off the remaining part of Love Canal to a developer without warning him of the dangers as Hooker Chemical had. The local government also punched holes in the clay walls to build water lines and a highway. This allowed the toxic waste to escape when rainwater washed them through the gaps created in the walls. People then began to, of course, suffer consequences from this. They complained and complained for decades about bad smells. People's basements in their homes had these foul odors. In 1976, the city finally hired a firm to check this out. They found, in fact, toxic residues in neighboring homes. And so the city said, I know, we'll get fans in your homes to blow all the bad smells out. In 1978, they finally began to do some limited evacuations, but it took intense pressure to get the government that had caused the problem to do anything significant about it. Another kind of problem you see, and this is much more recent, would be the 737 MAX case. There were two 737 MAX aircraft that had crashed within a 6-month period. Of course, this got everybody's attention, what's going on with these aircraft, and it turns out the Federal Aviation Administration had a lot to do with why these airplanes were crashing. Now, this is a little bit indirect, and so follow me closely here. What happened was that the FAA has had a long-standing regulation that says that pilots can qualify on a type of aircraft, and once they're qualified on that type, they don't have to get requalified on unless they change to a different type. Okay, so you qualify on the 737. So I'm a 737 qualified pilot now. So that gives the aircraft manufacturers like Boeing a strong incentive to maintain that type, and if they make changes, not make changes enough to change the type designation that the FAA is going to give the aircraft, because then that means the FAA is going to insist that everybody get requalified on this new type. So the FAA says in order to be the same type, it's got to have the same handling characteristics. Well, Boeing put these new, updated, more powerful engines on the 737. They called it 737 MAX. And Boeing is restricted in what else they can change. Even though the engines present certain aerodynamic problems, Boeing can't change all this other stuff to kind of match the new engines, because then that makes it a new type, and that means the airlines are going to say, well, FAA is going to say we have to retrain all of our pilots now. Well, so what ended up happening is that in order to fix this kind of the handling differences is they installed software. The FAA reviewed this along with other changes that were made to the aircraft. They did not catch a problem with this software, even though they had come up with like 30 pages of other differences between the MAX and the previous 737s. Now, I mean, you could say that Boeing should have caught it, but the incentive structure that's being developed by these regulations is such that it creates this kind of perfect storm of design failure by Boeing. Would we have safe products without regulation? Well, you can go back, I think last year at Mises U, I did a whole talk on product safety regulation. If you want more on that, just very briefly, tort law is very effective. You don't have to regulate something to make it more safe. If someone is damaged because of a defective product, I could take that person to court, that company to court. That's not a regulation, that is tort law. Murray Rothbard spends a lot of time talking about tort law and how we can rely on that as a means of encouraging encouraging product safety. User reviews. For a couple of decades now, we've been accustomed to this world in which there are reviews that you look at before you buy a product, before you take an Uber, before you buy something off of eBay or stay in a hotel. I mean, you're looking at these reviews, and this is very effective. It encourages not just safety, but also encourages firms to behave in ways that are conducive to consumer satisfaction. Private certification, it's there in the background. We don't really think about it, but Underwriters Laboratories is an example of this. A new product, like a toaster or something, is going to be sent by the manufacturer to Underwriters Laboratories. They're going to inspect it, take it through their lab processes, and make sure that when you plug it in, it doesn't catch fire. And then the company's going to say, okay, well, they've checked it out. We're pretty sure we're not going to get sued for this toaster catching people's homes on fire, so we're going to sell it now. And there are incentives, inherent incentives for firms to do this. Did you know that in the Soviet Union, way back in 1970s and 80s, they actually had a problem with televisions catching fire? This was quite serious, where the government was in charge of product safety. It didn't seem to work very well. Brand names and reputation are very important as well. Insurance companies have an incentive to monitor manufacturers so that they don't have to make big payouts if the product ends up being defective. So the insurance companies provide a kind of a private sector assurance of safety. At least in some cases, firms take better care of their customers than the customers would if they were left to their own devices. So one article by Yasuda in the Independent Review a few years ago, and I've got a link that I'll share with you later, said that fish and shellfish that are both caught and eaten by the same person, as like sport fishermen, pose more health risks than commercially sold seafood. Although recreational fishers tend to ignore warnings about hazardous chemicals in certain waters, commercial fishers voluntarily avoid contaminated areas. Also, in handling the catch, commercial fishers pay greater attention to sanitation than do recreational fishers. All right, number 4, capitalism leaves people without medical care, as though people are just going to be dying in droves without government to provide medical care. Well, the story is quite different. If you look at the history of medical care in the United States, it's restriction after restriction that tends to reduce the access to medical care rather than expand it. And one of the oldest of these interventions is medical licensure. So in the late 1800s, the United States had the highest number of physicians per capita in the world. In 1904, the American Medical Association, a doctors' organization, began an effort to reduce the number of medical students. Now, why would they do that? If you're a group of doctors who've already gotten through medical school and you're already practicing, why would you want to reduce the number of new doctors? Well, they claimed that this would improve medical quality. Well, we want people to have the best medical care. We don't want these snake oil salesmen practicing medicine. And you could always find people who are engaged in some sort of malpractice, kind of haul out as an example of this kind of thing. In 1910, we got the Flexner Report. Abraham Flexner, who's not a doctor, published a report for the Carnegie Foundation on medical education in the United States and Canada, and it suggested, surprise, surprise, given the incentives here, that most medical schools be closed. So the recommendation was that the medical schools go from 155 in the U.S. down to 31, U.S. and Canada. The recommendation was that medical education be standardized, no more experimentation with alternative techniques and procedures and new technologies. We don't want any of that. We want everything to be in the box. No thinking outside the, as Tom Woods would say, the 3x5 card of acceptable opinion. Any new medical school would have to be approved by the state government and subjected to additional state licensure regulations. So you have the governments that are using a group of doctors to restrict the competition to doctors through the whole bottleneck of medical schools and medical licensure. Among the schools that were closed were schools that had, medical schools that had catered to minority populations in the United States. The number of African American doctors plummeted after this because they were targeting those schools for closure. So we had not just fewer medical students, we had less access to medical education for certain subpopulations in the United States. Drug suppression, another gift of medical intervention by the government. If you want to get a new drug into the United States and sold in the United States, you have to pass a couple of major hurdles that can cost well over $1 billion in total. So you not only have to go through a long procedure of kind of private sector lab testing and so forth, you've got to pass the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is going to say you cannot sell this drug in the US unless it is safe and effective. Well, how safe, how effective, are we going to allow people who are sick to take a risk if they choose, if they want to take a little more of a risk because their suffering is very great. Can we do that? Well, the FDA is going to decide that for you, what your level of acceptable risk is. The delays imposed by these hurdles, the FDA hurdle being the most significant of these, the delays can cause death and suffering on their own. According to Mary Ruwart, at least half of pharmaceutical innovations get shelved because the cost of taking a drug through the regulatory testing process makes those drugs uneconomic for drug developers to pursue. And she found that the years of life lost due to FDA clinical demands is in the millions, which doesn't sound very safe. And I talk about the FDA sometimes with people, and they say, well, if we didn't have the FDA, then people would be selling the stuff that was dangerous, and they mentioned some example from 100 years ago, and it's like, do you really think that nothing would have changed if the FDA hadn't existed in 100 years? And do you think that companies would not be testing on their own to make sure they didn't get sued for selling people something that was bad for them? Is that what you think would happen? That without the FDA, people would be consuming rat poison in their medications because the company just wants to make a profit? I mean, it's not very profitable to kill off your customer base. And so firms would have an incentive on their own to make sure that their drugs are safe and effective. They want to preserve their reputation. It goes beyond this. Information suppression. Ruwart goes on to say that in the early 1980s, several reports in medical journals indicated that folic acid taken early in pregnancy could prevent a number of birth defects. But in order to advertise this benefit, the drug manufacturers would have to go through a very expensive drug development process to prove to the FDA that this is what would happen beyond the journal articles that had already indicated this. We may have seen far fewer birth defects in the United States had this information been, this kind of advertising been allowable. And then you probably heard of the EpiPen case. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm running short on time, but patents are another major hurdle to firms. If you wanted to invent an epinephrine delivery method to allow people who have severe allergies to get quick access to epinephrine and avoid the serious injury or death from anaphylactic shock, well, you've got to run up against Milan's patent. So people complain about the expense of medical care and monopoly, as though monopoly is some sort of private sector phenomenon. And here we have government creating monopolies called patents, temporary monopolies. And when I hear students say, well, we need the government to stop monopolies, I say, do you mean patents as well? Is that, would you be willing to include that in monopoly? Because the government is the single largest source of monopoly in the United States and many other countries. So you want your drug prices to be lower, but you also want the government to prevent these drug firms from having any competition. So it's no surprise that medical care has been one of the areas where we've seen one of the highest increases in cost over the years. And this chart I will use again later when I talk about higher education, where you can see hospital services are number one on that list. College tuition is second. We'll talk about that later. But these are areas where the government has funded and regulated and done more regulation and more funding, and of course the prices go up. And the other, the blue, where things have become more affordable, we don't see as much of that regulation and subsidization. I'm out of time, so I'll have to leave 5 and 6, but I do have a QR code for you here if you want to get the rest. There's a PDF on that page if you want to go through the whole thing. You can see my sources and all of that. And of course, I'll be happy to talk with you afterward if you have any further questions. Maybe there's something I didn't get to. and happy to talk to you at lunch or dinner as well. So thanks very much, and hope the rest of your day goes well.